Good evening. My name is Mark Barnico, and I'm the Executive Director of the University of Chicago Francis and Rose Ewan Campus in Hong Kong, our premier location in Asia, representing UChicago values of free and open discourse, rigorous debate, and the exchange of ideas. Welcome to the Pop Asia series. We're broadcasting tonight's event live via Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube from the UChicago Ewan Campus in Hong Kong. If audience members have questions to submit, please do so through the questions and answer button by first registering on Zoom. I also encourage you to visit our website at www.uchicago.hk and subscribe to our e-news for the latest news and information. Or you can also follow us on your UChicago Ewan Campus social media account on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Gigi Yen, our study abroad program manager and special projects coordinator, working with me here on the Ewan campus, will wrap up tonight's program again with a poll and more information about upcoming events you might find of interest. So please be sure to stay until the very end. Tonight we continue the Korean Wave mini-series on Pop Asia. Last week, Jenna Gibson and her guests discussed the evolution of K-pop during the pandemic. Tonight, we'll explore another major cultural export from South Korea, Korean dramas, or K-drama for short. The reach of Korean dramas is extended globally with the involvement of Netflix and other OTT or over-the-top media service platforms. The pandemic has also boosted K-drama's popularity while we've all been in lockdown, scanning for more programs to entertain us during COVID. I personally watched one of them during lockdown. You may all know the program Crash Landing on You. I have to say, it was something fun to watch and exposed me to a new genre and program format I was previously unfamiliar with. With new investment opportunities and a growing global audience, it's useful to understand how Korean production and distribution companies have adapted to new market dynamics and what the future of K-drama era will look like. K-dramas have also had a great impact on other social aspects in South Korea, like tourism, consumer retail, fashion, food, and the overall perception of South Korea as a country. Our guests tonight will be able to give you insights into these and many other questions. So let's get started with brief introductions of our guest speakers tonight. Shannon Cho is currently the head of content and creative representative director of Discovery Korean Networks. She has over 15 years of experience working in the media industry in Asia. She's worked for the Walt Disney Company, Fox, AXN, Viacom, and CJENM. Her roles have exposed her to business strategy development, show production and distribution, and marketing and public relations. She's worked on various campaigns, including the one for Shark Week. Hyunjung Stephanie No was born and raised in Seoul, South Korea. She received her BA in English Language and Literature from Korea University and MA in Journalism and Mass Communication from Yonsei University. Her interest in media studies originates from 10 years of work experience in Korean television networks as a programming producer, ratings analyst, acquisition specialist, and production budget manager. She's currently a candidate at the Department of Radio, Television, Film at Moody College of Communication, University of Texas at Austin for her PhD. Her research examines the expansion of the Korean wave on digital platforms, particularly within an industry and policy framework, and reveals the ways in which the local and global industries combine forces to create new global media trends. She currently serves as a submissions editor for the Velvet Light Trap. Min-Jun Lee received her BA from Williams College and master's and doctoral degree in gender studies from University of California in Los Angeles. Min-Ju is a visiting lecturer at Wellesley College in the Department of Women's and Gender Studies. Lee's research interests include theories on transnationalism, feminist media studies, and racial and gender politics in contemporary South Korea. She's currently working on a manuscript about Korean television dramas and their transnational fandom. Min-Ju examines the transnational popularity of Korean television dramas and how they impact the fantastical assumptions that foreigners may have for South Korea and its people. She draws on her ethnographic fieldwork with women from Europe and North America who traveled to Korea to form intimate relationships with Korean men. This phenomenon is known as Hallyu tourism. Finally, once again, we have Jenna Gibson, a PhD student in the Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago, as our moderator for tonight. Jenna's research interests include media effects, political communication, and public and cultural diplomacy. Jenna is a regular contributor to the Korea column for The Diplomat and has also written about Korean social issues for Foreign Policy. Before pursuing her doctorate at the University of Chicago, Jenna was Director of Communications at the Korea Economic Institute of America and previously lived in Cheonan, South Korea for 2 years as a Fulbright English teaching assistant. Shannon, Stephanie, Minju, and Jenna, thank you all for joining us tonight. Jenna, we're delighted to have you back to lead the conversation again tonight. I'll turn the program over to you.
Hi, good morning, everybody from Chicago. I hope everybody is doing well, and thank you so much for joining us, both the audience and our great panelists. I'm really excited to hear about their expertise on this awesome and evolving topic of Korean dramas. To start off, I'm going to ask each of them to kind of set the stage from their perspective. So just to jump right in, I'm going to go to Shannon first. Shannon, can you set the stage for us from the industry perspective? What are some of the changes that you've seen in the industry that have brought us to this moment?
Yeah, so I could say, like, when you speak about this K-wave Hallyu drama, the K-drama takes about like 85 to 90% of the K content. It follows right after the K-pop and the beauty. And especially in 2020, when the world was hit by unprecedented pandemic, all this content business has slowed down internationally, and a steady streams of the K-dramas from the global OTT platform has significantly boosted the K content's consumptions, and then pushing the K-drama into the online mainstreams, which shows in the very recent industry report by MPA that 1 in 5 respondents across the 22 countries have actually watched the Korean dramas during this pandemic period, with a high demos and viewing consistencies around this 25 to 35 female audience. These women were like in full-time employment, and then a lot of them were actually having the young children. And furthermore, the very interesting finding was the consumption of the Korean contents now outstrips time watching the US contents across the 4 key Southeast Asia countries like Singapore, Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, accounting more than 1/3 of the total streaming time, which was about 35%, whereas the US contents are taking about less than 30%. So K-drama was actually, this consumption was heavily relied on Asia before, even very recently, but it shows the gradual changes. And then this change has been seen dramatically in the past few years. You might have noticed, let me just share you just a quick screen. So you might have recognized some of this title. These are kind of top ranked Korean dramas on the various global OTT, and then some are commissions, not on the service yet, but these are kind of the contents which have been shown. And then I just like to briefly go through how these changes happen in the 3 different steps very quickly. So the first phase, I would say, is before 2016. At that time, about 100 title drama has been produced and mainly driven by the free TV stations. And then this drama was targeting for the local audience and very focused on the mellow, targeting for the Korean or overseas fans as a Japanese and a bit of Chinese. It really changes between 2017 and 2019, which I would call as a second phase. During this time, K-TV such as CJ and then JTBC start to step in this unscripted world, and then they start to take over the studio models. So CJ has set up the Studio Dragons in 2016, and their content start to flow in to the OTT platforms from 2017. And then SBS set out their studio side as a Studio S. JTBC Content Hub, which now changed to the JTBC Studios, has been actively working on it. And even though there is no significant changes in the budget at the time, it was still remaining same, like $500,000 per episode maximum as for scripted shows. The theme has been much diversified during this period, and they start to picking up the themes which were not covered in the free TV. And then during this period, you can really see that they have tried a lot of trials and then being experimental. For example, if you might have heard the Reply 1994, it's a trilogy about 1994, 1997, and then 88, which was one of the first scripted shows by CJ. This show actually hasn't been written by the scriptwriter. It was written by writers of the unscripted shows. And then she was very famous for one of the popular entertainment show called One Night, 2 Days by KBS. You might have seen it. So it was her first scripted work, The Reply 1994. And then now that she's one of the kind who has the great success of the both sides from the scripted and unscripted. In 2018, there has been another big changes is this Netflix has starting to pick up and buy the Korean drama. They haven't really invested heavily yet, but they start to really buy the Korean drama for Asian target. And then with these changes, the paid TV content export has first time exceeded the free TV content export. And then Asian reliance of this export has went down from the 90% in 2016 down to the 60% in 2018, and it's still going down gradually. And when it comes to the most interesting is the third phase, which is after 2020, when the pandemic period came. So our volume, the annual production volume has now grown up from 100 to the 130 to the 140 titles. This is mainly with the growing OTT investment, and they were actually the one who's providing much legitimated and easier access to this content to the global viewers. And when it comes back to this global pandemic, where there's nothing to watch it, and then hiatus in the international production market, people just zap in and then start to watch the Korean drama, and they start to have this stickiness in it. So the Netflix during this time up to now has served about 80 dramas. And then these dramas has been provided in 20 dub languages and then about 30 sub languages. So it was really being easy access to the global viewers compared to the before, where you need to really find it and you have to be really loyal fan to go for it. So, oops, sorry. So when you see this, this is the top 10 TV shows on Netflix last year during the pandemic. You can see in Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand, it was the Korean drama was actually very dominant, which takes about 6 to 8 out of the top 10 TV shows in the market. So that being said, they have not only introduced this Korean dramas into the new Korean dramas to the market, but they have actually introduced and then make the older titles to be revisited, like the Goblin and the Reply. So at this latest phases, the investments comes into the market and then demands have been much higher than the supply. Average budget has been gone up, and then now the market actually has been able to afford the bigger project. So the new titles, which you might be familiar, are like Ethar Chronicle. The budget has gone up from the $500,000 to 2.8 million per episode. Like Kingdom was 2.3 million. Mr. Sunshine was 1.8 million. And then Crash Landing on You, which Mark has seen it, was 1.6 million. So it's about triple to the 6 times bigger than the phase 1, like a 2-3 years ago budget. And then when you're looking to this is kind of a combined effect of the TV rating drops for the free TV, and they as heavily rely on the ad money cannot afford anything bigger than the $500,000 budget. and then demands of the international market, the interest was growing. So the OTT started to invest it heavily in Korean market. There are also the other global OTT business investing, like View is offering currently 600 titles in the Singapore, Philippines, and less in Malaysia, Indonesia. Apple TV commissioned Pachinko with Lee Min-ho in Yoon Yo-jung, which will be released soon. And then they commissions also the webtoon-based SF thrillers called Dr. Brain. This will be directed by one of famous feature directors, Kim Ji-woon, with Lee Seung-gyun in it. So we are really living in an era of the global collaborations of the K-drama at the moment, and it's expanding. And I cannot really wait to see more creative contents in the coming years with the diverse partnership.
Okay, that was so great. Shannon, thank you so much for giving us a little bit of background and bringing us through these trends. Even over the last few years, as you said, things have changed so quickly. So I want to turn to Stephanie now. You know, we've talked about these changes and particularly a new era of collaboration between Korean companies and international partners like Netflix. Can you talk a little bit about what those partnerships look like and what this means?
Yeah, sure. I first want to say thank you to Shannon. That was a very great short introduction to such a huge amount of history and broad changes. And I think the answer to this next question about partnerships with Korean drama productions, like the local production side and international investment coming in together is a good segue into what I want to talk about. And I also have a slide prepared. So I have a slide to introduce the different forms of K-drama procurement that Netflix does with local producers or channels. And I focus on Netflix as an example because it's comparable to other countries as well. And it's more convenient to talk about it in a global context. And like Shannon said, like a lot has changed since 2016. And when Netflix entered, 2016 is actually when Netflix also entered Korea, and it wasn't easy for them to gather a huge subscriber base in the beginning. So it's kind of similar to what Shannon has been saying, but they had to build up a K-drama content library, which was one of their most important strategies in overcoming this. So, and I have here the 3 different types of how they procure K-drama so that it's easier for us to talk about it as we move forward. So first, I want to talk about acquisitions. These are titles acquired after they finished airing on local networks or even after other international channel licenses have ended. For example, when Drama Fever shut down, Netflix would pick up those shows. And they maybe or may not be exclusive, but they're definitely not first run. And then I want to talk about co-commissions, which I have here, Crash Landing on You Again, but also other shows like Mr. Sunshine. And I think a lot of the titles in the top 10 that Shannon introduced were mostly co-commissions. And these shows are when local channels and Netflix would invest together into a production. They would share the cost and take different distribution routes. So the local channels would take the first run, and then depending on the program, a couple of hours or a couple of days later, international first run would be released through Netflix worldwide. So domestically in Korea, these shows would be available on the local channel and Netflix, but outside of Korea, it would be exclusive to Netflix. So they would market it internationally as Netflix originals. And this would significantly decrease the burden of production costs for the local channels and producers, because like Shannon said, because even when the second window sales collapse because of Netflix, since Netflix takes all the international rights by paying up to 60 to 70% of the production cost, it significantly decreases the burden of production costs for the local channels. And then finally, this is an interesting one that has been changing K-drama production a lot in Korea, which is full commissions, shows like Kingdom. It's when Netflix greenlights and fully pays for the production costs, working directly with the production companies with no local channels involved. And they would take all the IP rights, intellectual property rights. So there would be no local channel airing these shows, and Netflix would be the exclusive platform to gain access to these shows in Korea as well. And fully commissioned titles are the only exclusive Netflix originals within Korea. But for outside of Korea, both co-commissions and full commissions are marketed as Netflix originals due to their exclusivity outside of Korea. So these are different kinds of partnerships that Netflix does to procure K-drama on Netflix. And naturally, due to the different stakeholders involved, they'll take different forms of contracts, right? And so far, I think co-commissioning has been the most effective for Netflix to gain subscribers for K-drama viewers. And this has been confirmed once more by data that Shannon has shared. There are about 20 titles a year that Korean local channels are co-commissioning with Netflix, not the others, but and by contract. And these include companies like Studio Dragon, JTBC Studios, and even the terrestrial broadcasters are now co-commissioning with Netflix. And these local channels have been the K-drama powerhouses for decades. So these shows tend to maintain the conventional style of K-drama. And the saying goes in the industry that the best scripts are first pitched to Studio Dragon, and then to JTBC, and then to the terrestrial broadcasters. But if you think about it, Netflix co-commissions in volumes with all of these production companies, and usually the titles with the highest production value are contracted with Netflix because they cost more. So co-commissioning would allow Netflix to have a stable supply of the best K-drama productions while these contracts are in effect. So it's not very difficult to predict that a good portion of well-made K-dramas are being circulated exclusively through Netflix internationally, at least for now, while they are in contract.
Okay, thank you so much. We've learned a lot about the drama side, the industry side, how these things get onto our TV screens. But of course, we need to talk about the fans, right? None of this would be happening if there weren't people watching it and consuming it all over the world. So Minju, with all these changes, obviously this has an impact on the consumers and fans, especially international fans. Can you tell us a little bit about that side of things?
Yes, definitely. And I will also be talking a lot about Netflix as well, because in my opinion, Netflix has changed the way that people view television, Korean television dramas. There are two aspects that I want to talk about. One is that Netflix has widened the viewership of Korean television dramas, because prior to Netflix offering all these Korean television dramas for streaming, easy streaming, fans had to seek out or tune into television programs, which was very difficult because everyone has busy schedules, or they had to seek out specific websites that provided Korean television dramas or Asian media. For example, Stephanie mentioned Drama Fever, which is gone now, unfortunately. But for example, Drama Fever or Rakuten Viki or other fan-run websites that used to offer Korean television dramas for streaming. But people had to specifically seek out those websites as opposed to Netflix, where they could just click on one show and just watch it and try it out to see if they like it or not, and then continue on a binge of Korean television dramas. But while Netflix widened the viewership for Korean television dramas, another thing that I noticed was that Netflix doesn't really have a place for a designated comment section where viewers can interact with each other. So viewership has become a little bit more individual or independent and small group, as opposed to the websites that I just mentioned, like Rakuten Viki or the fan-run websites, where a sense of community building was such a big part of watching Korean television dramas. Fans would build communities across national borders, across different cultural contexts, by saying or recommending the television dramas they enjoy to other fans, as well as kind of fawning or expressing their love for the particular television drama character that they're in love with. And in those like traditional, I guess, ways that people viewed Korean television dramas, that sense of community was more important. But in Netflix, it's not so much anymore. So that's the second part that I wanted to mention.
All right, so I'm going to go back to Stephanie, and we actually had a question about this in the question box too. So this is a perfect topic to go to next. We've talked about all these shifts, both the industry side, production side, among fans. But what does that actually look like when you're watching a drama on the screen? Have you noticed that there might be anything different about the types of shows produced? You mentioned that genre might be changing a little bit based on these changes. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. And I also have another share screen prepared because I wanted to talk about genre diversification. So yeah, like I mentioned before, and most of the programs on terrestrial and even pay TV, although they're diversifying and trying new things and experimenting new things, the co-commission shows that are based on like pay TV or free TV usually follow the conventional K-drama romantic trope, right? But for Netflix fully commissioned shows, the ones like Kingdom, where Netflix greenlights and fully pays for the production cost, they aim for what broadcasters cannot do. So in the 2000s or so, cable also tried to diversify from romantic-centric K-dramas to something called genre content. For example, like episodic serials similar to CSI, but these didn't do so well in international sales. So despite of cable's experimentation with television series genre, there were still many things that terrestrial or even cable were conventionally not allowed to do just because they were television. So one of them being extreme violence, like they couldn't air any of those on K-drama. But since Netflix is an internet-based content distributor, it's much more lenient for them to produce something where violence goes beyond rated R or even very unconventional storylines with extreme fantasy elements. And this doesn't mean that Netflix is particularly going after these kinds of shows, but I'm saying that it's just opening up the various options for them to take. So they don't have to turn down a particular show due to their extremities. So a lot of the K-drama series that Netflix picks up are actually ones that were turned down from either terrestrial or pay TV. And here I have a couple of examples of those shows. First of all, Kingdom. Now we're all pretty familiar with this one. It's a Korean historical zombie series. And we know that zombies don't exist in Korean mythology. It's a Western horror genre, right? But because it's Netflix, you're able to merge Korean historical period drama with zombie horror. Sweet Home is similar. It's based on a webtoon, but this level of horror would usually be a low budget summer horror film in Korea. But on Netflix, you're able to hire Lee Young-bok, who is the producer behind Descendants of the Sun or The Guardian. And you're able to hire Lee Young-bok to make a series out of it. And both Kingdom and Sweet Home were known for their extreme violence and their high production costs due to their film-like production value, right? And the next one, Extracurricular, is another odd one. It's about a high school student making money through human trafficking. Now, this theme is really out there for Korean television, but on Netflix, you can make it. And there's even I think it's a US version, but it's much more toned down, teen crime to regular murder. And then lastly, as an example, I have The School Nurse Files for extreme fantasy. It's where the heroine goes after jelly monsters that only she can see to protect her students. And this one is based on a fictional novel. So these are original Korean IPs, intellectual properties, that wouldn't have come to screen in the quality that it did without Netflix. And they're not in line with conventional K-drama styles, but still, they're nevertheless Korean storytelling. So these are very niche shows where it wouldn't make sense to produce for just the local Korean market or Korean audience. But if these niche audiences are aggregated worldwide, they may make a big enough market to form, to be able to produce these shows. And I think that's the logic behind why Netflix is making these very niche genres locally.
So just to add up a comments for Stephanie, I do agree with her comments that because of the global investments coming in, it kind of removed the barriers and conventional thinking that this might not be possible on the free TV, and now it can be brought up. But at the same time, I think it is also the nature of the media's devices that we are using. So TV is very family friendly. The remote control usually goes to parents, not for the children's. And then when I just refer to the research the main target of the K-dramas, even though it's the female skews, is between the early 20s and then 30s. So when it goes to with the cord cuttings, it goes to the OTT, which even though you can have the individual account, it's allowed to have the concurrent streams for the 4 people, you can kind of access to your appetite contents, which can be watched not on the big screen, but can be brought up, watch it personally in your rooms. And then they're kinds of giving the producers also to give a try to experiment the different themes. And then one of the good things, not only the Netflix, but I think but Netflix is one of the best, but Views or other global OTT also has is they are very data driven. They have a great recommendation system. So once you watch the things and then click on it, whether you like it or not, and they can recommend it directly. So you see kind of the trends and then where people's interests are moving on. So easier to diversify and then make a personalized theme of the contents.
Yeah, I'm actually going to stick with you for a moment, Shannon. So we've talked about how the dramas themselves look a little bit different based on these changes. But I believe you mentioned briefly that on the production side, there's also some differences in terms of, ability to finance things with ads, for example, or the production profit sharing model has changed. Can you talk a bit about that, please?
So basically, before the global OTT came in, when you're launching a drama, it has to be financed by free TV. So you need to get a slot from the free TV to actually start the productions. And then this free TV programming cost was about 60 to 70% of the total budget. And the remaining 30 to the 40% were sponsored or the product placement procured by the production house. So if the show is successful, then they need to sell it, license it in the other third-party broadcasters or internationally. But at the time, since the production house doesn't have the capacity, the IP usually belong to the free TV. And then free TV, when they are selling international licensing, the show hasn't been really having that global popularity yet. So maximum, if the show is successful, they have 10% profitability. When it comes to the global, you might have read it from the news. So let's take Mr. Sunshine as an example. When the total budget is about 3 to 4 times bigger than the conventional free TV dramas, people thought like you're never gonna finance it anyway, right? And then Netflix came in and they pre-buy the rights before it went to the pre-productions, 70% of the total production budget. And then CJ, the broadcaster, pay TV, which is not the free TV, so took about 40 to 50% of the total production budget. So they already have secured about 120% of the total budget to start to kicking off. And then the remaining will be the production house, who would then need to work on the product placement or the sponsor, but it wasn't not really the priority of themselves, but it was actually the quality of the show was their priority. And at the time, and also the thing is that product placement until recently is really targeted for the local market audience. It doesn't really fly outside. And then now the people, and then the ad money, that the agency and all these advertisement people start to thinking about it's not only the K-dramas or K-pop that works, but the beauty product and then foods are flying travel across the Asia and then globally. They start to think about how we are going to expand this and then use it for the international market. But until now, unfortunately, the product placement is targeting for the local market, and then it will be spill over to the other international market. So compared to the 10% of the profitability before, the current model will be the upfront, very upfront, because we have all the money secures, so no worry during the productions, and then they can guarantee about 30 to the 40%.
Okay, yeah, we've been talking so much about all these big changes. It's really fascinating. But it seems like the audience is also really interested in fan behaviors. So I'm going to go back to Minju. This is your research, right? You're talking about fan behavior and particularly travel. But of course, that's not really possible right now. So how do you think COVID or lockdowns have changed fan behaviors in the way that they're interacting, especially as you mentioned that places like Netflix are not necessarily built-in places for community where people are watching anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So like traditional forms of tourism is almost non-existent and has been non-existent for the entire pandemic era because it's so difficult to cross borders in this particular time that we're living in. But there are still different kinds of tourism that occur among the fans. And what I'm talking about is virtual tourism. I have a great example of what I mean by that. I have heard from many of the fans cases of where they have never actually been physically to Korea, but they know all the ins and outs of small streets and restaurants and everything in Korea. And I was like, how do you know all the streets in Korea when you have never been to it physically? How do you know more about streets in Seoul when I have been the one who have been living in Seoul? And their response was that because they love Korean television drama so much, they searched all the streets, random streets in Korea via Google Map. And they went through virtual tourism on Google Map by looking at the street views repeatedly. And they memorized basically all of the important roads in Seoul and different areas of Korea. And they use their imagination basically to travel because they couldn't physically travel to Korea. So that's one step of how people are coping with this era where transnational travel is very much difficult. Even if we're not seeing them physically present in Korea and moving across borders, they're still traveling to Korea through their imaginations.
That's really fascinating. I know that at least during normal times, that was a big draw for a lot of people, was to go to the place where their favorite drama was filmed, or to take a picture in a certain spot where their favorite actor got together with the main female lead or something like that. So it's really fascinating to see that people are really entrepreneurial. They found some way to still replicate that even though we're all locked down, right? Mm-hmm. I want to talk more about the content itself, because again, we've been talking about this background stuff, we've been talking about reception, a little bit about genre, but I think a lot of people wonder, and especially people who are just getting into dramas or maybe have heard about it, they kind of wonder, why K-dramas? Why are K-dramas so popular? What is it about the industry, the content, the fan base? What has made it so successful around the world? Maybe I'll go to Stephanie first, and then if you want to jump in, other panelists, please.
Yeah, I also wonder, and that's a very good question. And I was recently studying Netflix, and when you look at Netflix's strategy, it's pretty clear that each country has like a different strengths. And for Korea, it's K-drama. And for Japan, for example, they have strength in animation. And for India, they're feature films. And that's what they focus in for like the different regions. And it's not to say that they don't have television series, but somehow for Korea, it's been strengthened that way. And I think it's the whole history behind it, starting from the late 1990s after the economic crisis, when South Korean television was okay, it was produced well, but it was starting to sell very cheaply across Asia. And that's when it really started gaining visibility. And so from that history, it really started to become price competitive, and the market itself is also very competitive. But now, like, it's even becoming more competitive because they're not only competing within the industry, but now they have to compete with something like Netflix, who's even investing even more. So the competition is growing. And another thing I want to talk about is intellectual property. I brought it up a couple of times, but like the storytelling, the original storytelling that comes out of Korea, it's an industry where they're able to find like the right originators, the right creators, and bring that out to make a product that works for Korean television series.
Minju, do you have any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's been a question that I've been thinking about since I started my research on Korean television dramas 6 years ago at this point. And unfortunately, I still haven't reached a definitive answer and a great answer about why Korean television dramas are so popular. Because even though I have asked a lot of people who participated in my research as Korean television drama fans from different parts of the world who traveled to Korea, every one of them had different answers for why they enjoyed watching Korean television dramas. Many of the people whom I spoke to who were in their early 20s, who traveled to Korea to form sexual or romantic relationships with Korean men. So it's a small group of Korean television drama fans, mentioned that the appeal of Korean television dramas for them was how Korean masculinity was depicted in Korean rom-coms or melodramas. But that cannot be the reason that a middle-aged woman in different parts of the world may be watching or consuming Korean television dramas, or how heterosexual men may be watching Korean television dramas. So in conclusion, I don't have a good answer for it. I just speculated about it all the time.
Yeah, it's hard. I think it's also hard, especially as genres are getting more diverse too. You're going to get a more diverse audience, or an audience that's looking for different types of content. So this answer will continue to change and diversify, where each individual person is finding something different that they can latch onto, right? Shannon, do you have any thoughts about why K-dramas?
So I think that, my views also overlap with what Stephanie's and Minju said. So I've been just thinking about this since our kind of pre-meeting last time, and then came up with like a kind of the 5 big pointed, which will fit like someone's interested in it. Like, like as Stephanie mentions, it started as the cost-effective content. It was cheaper than Hollywood, but it has really good, high-quality content. It's no longer cheap, but the production values of the cinematographies and then like the music in the OST really mixing well. That's one thing. Second thing could be, that what it resonates to the fans are quite universal. So it's about like love, joy, families, angers. So it's really universal emotions, but the K-drama knows how to formulate it in a very nifty way. So it's a bit cliche, but like if you see it well executed, it is very satisfying. So you see any rom-coms, there's always the scene the heroes pulling the heroines from the traffic, and then everyone's like, oh wow. So that's kind of the thing, how they are coding it. And then third would be celebrity, very attractive character itself, but also it ties to what they are wearing as a fashions and what they are putting as a makeup, so that can expand it to the interest. I would say then the first will be the diversified genre, which we also covered. You name it, there is an action, there is a rom-com, mysteries, histories, zombie even. So everything is there, so you can grab it. And then the last one will be the cultures for the international fan. Korea wasn't really well-known country. People didn't, things they know was about the North Korea. So when you are seeing this universal K-drama, the thing that they are trying to do is they are not trying to water down the Korean culture inside. You see still they are eating on the tables, on the floors with their grandparents, which doesn't really happen in the normal days. And then, or if you see the drinking parties, you kind of see how the Koreans are drinking and then what kind of game they are playing. So all this combined, I think that becomes a bit exotic and exciting for them to watch it.
Kind of continuing with Shannon's comment about the last part about the culture being very interesting for people who watch Korean television dramas who weren't previously aware of Korean culture. I have a funny anecdote of where I helped this tourist from France pack like about 6 or 7 bottles of soju in her carry-on or bag before she went on her flight back to France. And I was asking her, why are you packing so much soju? Are you going to drink that all by yourself? And by the way, for everyone who doesn't know what soju is, it's a Korean alcohol. It's in a green bottle and it's featured a lot in Korean television dramas. The characters drink it when they're happy, when they're celebrating, when they're sad, or whatever the occasion is. And her answer was that she's bringing all these soju in her bag, even though it's extremely heavy, because she's going to give 1 bottle each to all of her friends back in France who couldn't make it to Korea, because they're all curious about what soju actually tastes like. They've seen it so many times in Korean television dramas that they all want to try it out, and it's too expensive in France to buy. So that's one example of going back to what Shannon mentioned about culture being the draw for some of the fans.
I have a similar,
Please go ahead.
anecdote where which kind of molds together like my interest in IP and then the culture side of like food spreading. Like a lot of foreign audiences also read Korean webtoons and translated web novels, and they find like they sometimes ask questions like, why do Koreans eat jjajangmyeon? What is tteokbokki? Like, why is everyone eating tteokbokki and jjajangmyeon? And then of course there was the japaguri, which is called ramendong in English, which came out on Parasite. So as they're watching or consuming all these Korean content, like they definitely show a lot of interest in culture.
Yeah, so far we've been talking a lot about different, positive things, I would say, generally, but we do have a lot of questions, people wondering about if there's any downsides to, the proliferation of Korean dramas or the transnational trend here. Some people were particularly wondering about, a lot of these dramas, as you guys mentioned, are very fantastical, even if they're not fantasy or they're not horror, but they're depicting romances in a way, for example, that is not necessarily how someone might actually experience a romance in a normal life. So do you see in general any downsides to the increasing trend of transnational consumption and production of Korean dramas? I'll ask Minju first.
Yes. Going along with what you just mentioned exactly about how romance is depicted in a lot of Korean television dramas, I firsthand watched so many tourists' hearts get broken over the Korean men they meet in Korea, because they came to Korea as tourists with a fantasy that they were going to meet Korean men who would act like the male characters in romantic Korean television dramas and have their own Korean television drama while they're in Korea and dating this Korean men. And some of them were happy, but many of them were disappointed at what they found in Korea. And that goes to like the question about what might be the potential downside of transnational dissemination of Korean television dramas, is that maybe some people who view it might view Korean television dramas and the way it depicts Korean culture and Korean romantic life or Korean gender performances as what it is, actual depictions of what life is like in Korea in reality. And if they have this essentialist notion of what Korean culture might be, they might have a humongous culture shock when they actually arrive in Korea in person or interact with a Korean person in their home nations.
Stephanie, what do you think about this?
I have two thoughts. I agree with Minju in the way that if foreign travelers come to Korea with the expectation that my fantasy rom-com will come to real life, it's similar to watching a Hollywood film and wanting to go to Hollywood, you know, to become a part of, and my life will become a part of, you know, US consumer culture, you know. So it kind of it's I guess that is like a real life, like coming to real life kind of downside. I've even heard of like North Korean defectors having watched South Korean television dramas and wanting to come to South Korea so much, but then they realize this gap of lifestyle that's been going on for generations, and they just don't fit. So yeah, the reality versus the fantastical romantic comedy that's depicted on K-drama will definitely be quite different. But I guess the one reason that it's the same reason why K-drama is popular though, across the world. They want to see those, they want to see those fantastical romantic relationships. And K-drama gives that to the audience. Although it's fairy tale, it can be critiqued, but it's something that's providing for the audience that is lacking in other, like, for example, Hollywood films or Hollywood television series, which is less detailed and relationship-based kind of, you know, back and forth relationships.
Shannon, do you have anything to add? Any potential downsides?
No, I completely agree with two ladies that it's kind of vicarious satisfactions you choose seek for kind of this drama. And it might not be just for the K-dramas, like Stephanie says, the Koreans are when watching for like the French movies, they are dreaming about French life. And then when you go to Paris, you got so disappointed with stinkiness and all this stuff. Sometimes it happens. So I would say, since today's event is more about the public, I would say that as the Korean dramas getting the global popularity, something that I think we should be aware is that we have to respect the diversity and integrations of the other cultures. So one mentions like the Rocket Boys, famous badminton dramas recently on air. It depicts Indonesian cultures. And then I think that some of the research was wrong, or it gives the kind of the negative images of Indonesians, which is something that the producers at the time when they are writing it should have to sufficient research and then respect the other culture as well. But it was so focused on the local audience and they think it's not really important. But eventually, since it gains the global popularity, we should also take the responsibility of what happens after.
If I can follow up on that, because I think there's quite a few questions in the chat as well about the content, both positively and negatively, including more, for example, non-Korean actors, or including social issues more than just kind of a glossy, perfect life in Korea. But then also, you know, including some things that are, you know, because the audience is more transnational, they're picking up on maybe some issues with those depictions, or some issues that they want to critique, or that they find problems with. Can you talk a little bit more about that, actually? Shannon, why don't you start off, and then if anyone wants to jump in, please do.
So I think this would be same for other local scripted contents once it gains the more popularity outside of the market. But I do believe that unlike unscripted shows, which can be transnational cast, whereas the common language can be used, it can be still being played. The scripted shows, as a Korea with one single language, it's so difficult to have the multinational cast to be included. I think the situations are changing, and then some people, there's a lot of the international shows happening, and there's some foreigners who are interested in the cultures start to come to Korea, learn Korean, and then they start to be shown on the screens. So I think it will gradually change it. But as of yet, the scripted shows are really, really targeted for the Korean audience. They don't really, except a few Netflix commissions dramas or the initially, like from the very beginning, targeted for the global OTT. Most of the Korean drama out of the 130, I think less than 30s are targeting for international market from the beginning. Hundreds are targeted for the Korean audience, and it gets the big success and it will travel to Asia.
Do either of you have anything to add to that? No.
I think I think there's a show on Netflix that specifically speaks to that, where they have like international students coming to Korea. So it's like a whole mix of diverse cultures happening. Like it's a series that's happening in Korea, but it's not mainstream television though. It's like a very rare specific case. So yeah, as more and more diverse genres and more diverse original stories keep coming out, I think it'll be less mainstream and have more diversity going forward.
Okay, I do want to turn to a couple of audience questions specifically because there's some really good ones here. There are a couple that I'm going to kind of put together because they're on a similar theme, which is that are there any concerns that with Netflix, other OTT powerhouses, especially international ones, really coming into the market and changing things, is there any concern that that could somehow overtake or have a negative impact on the local entertainment industry? And then also, if that happens, or with this transnational trend, will that take the K out of K-drama? What is Korean about it when it is a transnational production? Maybe let's go to, how about Stephanie? Do you want to try that one first?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, to make the short answer first, it'll be difficult to take out the K out of K-drama because although I do agree, some parts are becoming more universal, more Hollywood-like, but that's more on a technical kind of a base, I think. And I guess some people could argue for something like formats, Netflix is also contracted to make the Korean version of Money Heist, I think. So something like that, it'll be a story that's universal and able to be produced in any country, right? But still, why would they make a Korean version then? It's gonna have the Korean language, the Korean actors, the Korean landscapes, and it'll be interpreted a little differently, right? So there's still going to be the uniqueness, I think. Even though there will be some kind of a universalizing factor, kind of like what Hollywood is trying to do with their superheroes, like it's, the story would fit anywhere, but I still think there's several several Korean factors that will keep people coming back and checking out those Korean culture factors.
Yeah, what do you think about that, Minju?
Yeah, Stephanie gave such a great answer. I agree with what Stephanie just mentioned. And it goes to the root of the question about what does K even mean in the K-drama or K-pop? Was there something traditional about it, K-pop or K-drama, that made it so much more Korean than other kinds of entertainment? And I mean, as Stephanie mentioned, as long as a significant part of the people who are creating the television dramas who are featured on it and the locations where the television dramas are filmed are located within Korea, I think people will still perceive the drama as Korean, even if it has more of a transnational production staff as well as a transnational actors.
So on that theme, I want to ask this question too, and I'll go to you first, Shannon. Given that there's something maybe uniquely Korean, or there's certain aspects that whether it's language or certain themes or things like that will continue to be Korean K-drama. is it possible for the success of K-dramas to be replicated in other countries, or how can other countries see this success and try to, maybe transnationalize their film industry? Or is that a thing that people should want to do in other countries, I guess?
I think, this is the very interesting time for everyone. Before, we did have the barriers between each countries. And then now, thanks to this global OTT, where they provided this easy access to people, global viewers, to getting access to the same contents at the same time. This is really an opportunity for the producers, not just for K-dramas. I think, Thailand's and productions also has a value. Philippines, like the movies, has a great values. So many of the Asian countries or Latin countries even have their uniqueness, which can travel to the other countries as far as it's universal. But keeping the uniqueness, I think there is a possibility. As an industry person, something that I was concerned when you first asked the questions about would this global player would take over the control. So that's my concerns, because when one of the contents is getting the popularity, demands goes up more than supply. But the supply, the key resources like the producer, talent, writers, they don't know all of a sudden grows. So the prices are jacked up. So those big productions which can afford that and that which this global OTT wanted to buy it will keep growing, but the smallers and who wouldn't have the chance could kind of eliminate it in the competition, so could have the polarization. So I think it's kind of important also, not just for the industry side or the consumer side, but the government side to support, to build a kind of a constructive ecosystem for everyone.
All right, we are getting close to the end of our time here, so I do want to wrap up and give you guys a chance to leave your final thoughts with this question. How do you see things moving forward, especially in this kind of odd time that we're in right now, and a lot of changes very quickly in the industry and in fandom? What trends are you keeping an eye on? How are things going to move forward for the K-drama industry? Let's go to Minju first.
I don't really have a definitive answer to that either, because as I keep mentioning, fans tend to be very creative, and fans can end up doing things that are completely, totally unexpected. I've learned that from my field research and interviews with the fans, that the ways they consume Korean culture, the types of Korean television dramas that they consume, and the ways that they interact with Korean culture once they're in Korea are just beyond expectations. I entered my research thinking one thing and left with a completely different aspect about the Korean wave and Korean television dramas transnational fandom. So I'm sorry to say again, I don't have a definitive answer or prediction about where the Korean wave is going to go or Korean television drama popularity is going to turn up in the fan aspect. They can go anywhere because fans are all over the place. They're so creative and they just invent things beyond our expectations.
Yeah, Shannon, what do you think?
Same as Minju, this is people business. It's not a simple export product, but a kind of a gateway to the culture. And then it is a really interesting time. You have a big investment, you have a great fans. So we're gonna just keep watching how it evolves and then hope to make a better futures for the K-drama.
All right, and we'll close off. Any thoughts from Stephanie to look forward to the future?
I actually think it's accelerating the speed of the Korean wave, the way it's being distributed. I see it as accelerating, especially due to technology. Companies like Netflix, just think about Crash Landing on You. If that was distributed with the conventional route, it would be distributed to the normal Asian countries that companies would usually trade with. But with Netflix, it hit the charts. It was #1 in the US for a whole week during the pandemic. So I see it as accelerating. I also agree these are very exciting times. Shannon also mentioned, Korea is producing 30 to 40% more of television series. The production quality is, I don't know, it's film quality. It's film quality. You can now see television series that have, you know, film quality. Film producers are all coming to television due to these OTT platforms. So everything is developing and going faster and more competitive. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay, this has been a really great discussion. There's so much more we could always talk about for hours, I'm sure, but I think that's a great place to stop. I want to thank you guys for such a great discussion, and thank you all for really, really great questions too. And hopefully we can continue this type of discussion more in the future. But for now, I'm going to go hand it over to Gigi to wrap us up.
Jenna, Shannon, Stephanie, and Minju, thank you for the fantastic discussion this evening. This discussion has surely brought insights on how K-drama has evolved over these last few years, how OTT platforms and international investments are making a difference for the industry, and the social impact that K-drama has for its viewers in South Korea. I am sure our audience appreciates the insights that you are shared tonight. Thank you so much. We have a brief poll to supplement tonight's program for the audience on Zoom. Please complete it while I tell you more about the next program. We will be starting a new mini-series within Pop Asia on video games in first week of September. Professor Patrick Jagoda from University of Chicago will be leading this program with an array of great scholars and experts. So if you or anyone you know are gamers and want to know more about game studies in the 21st century, including game culture across the globe and the design and creation of video games, do sign up for UChicago's upcoming video game webinars. More details about the webinars will be available in our social media platforms later this week. Make sure to follow our Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and the Yun Campus website for registration information. We look forward to seeing you again in September. Have a great rest of your summer and good night.